This video is in response to a previous video posted by Scientific Discussion, a member at YouTube, and the video is entitled A Question for Believers in Objectivism. And the main question asked was, how does Rand integrate what's been formerly called rationalism from empiricism, basically, and specifically how would Rand view the empiricists? It turns out the answer will probably be found more in looking at Rand's conception of rationalism and with very little reference to empiricism, so I'm going to go that route. I'm going to try to answer your question in three quotes from four books, or from three quotes from two books, and I'll show you those books. The first book that I'm going to quote from, in hopes of answering your question, is Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand Lexicon, Objectivism from A to Z. The cover of my copy is worn off because I guess I use it a fair amount of time. Okay, I'm going to open up this book to page 404, and the subject is rationality, and the excerpt, this is a book of excerpts. The excerpt is from Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Okay, I'm just going to read. Rationality. Rationality is man's basic virtue, the source of all his other values. Man's basic vice, the source of all his evils, is the act of unfocusing his mind, the suspension of his consciousness, which is not blindness but the refusal to see, not ignorance but the refusal to know. And break. Further down it says, the virtue of rationality, and then I'll break, means one's total commitment to a state of full awareness, to the maintenance of a full mental focus in all issues, in all choices, in all of one's waking hours. It means a commitment to the fullest perception of reality within one's power, and to the constant active expansion of one's perception, i.e., of one's knowledge. It means a commitment to the reality of one's own existence, i.e., to the principle that all of one's goals, values, and actions take place in reality, and therefore one must never place any value or consideration whatsoever above one's perception of reality. It means a commitment to the principle that all of one's convictions, values, goals, desires, and actions must be based on, derived from, chosen and validated by a process of thought, as precise and scrupulous a process of thought directed by as ruthlessly strict an application of logic as one's fullest capacity permits. That's Rand's view on rationality itself, which is a little bit different from rationalism, which we'll find out is when you're stuck inside your head, and empiricism, which we'll find out is when you're headless or brainless. You don't have the concepts, merely your brain is just a sensitive organ, a sensory organ. That's something like Hume has argued. And we're going to focus on the rationalists like Leibniz to show how they're different from Rand's version of rationalism, or rationality, let's say that. They're not the same. And here's the proof. It's on page 405, the next page. Rationalism versus empiricism. This is Rand talking, an excerpt from a book, For the New Intellectual. Philosophers came to be divided into two camps. Notice she's saying they came to be divided, and it could be somewhat arbitrarily or due to earlier errors in thinking. Those who claimed that man obtains his knowledge of the world by deducing it exclusively from concepts which come from inside his head and are not derived from the perception of physical facts. Okay, and that she calls the rationalists, and Leibniz would be a fine example. And those who claim that man obtains his knowledge from experience, which was held to mean by direct perception of immediate facts with no recourse to concepts. I'm laughing because it's kind of silly how philosophers used to think. To put it more simply, those who joined the mystics by abandoning reality, and those who clung to reality by abandoning their mind. Okay, so Rand is talking about the historical dichotomy between rationalism and empiricism, each focusing on an abandonment. Rationalism, or rationalists, abandon reality and just work from inside their head. Another philosopher called it the inside-out philosophers. Empiricists work by abandoning their mind. And like I said before, taking the brain as like a sensory organ, and it just senses. There's no room for concepts. Now Hume does talk about vague things, ideas, impressions, but there's no room for in his philosophy for true conceptual distinction. Anyway, let's give that example of Leibniz, the rationalist, the consummate rationalist, I guess, and how it's going to be different from Rand's view of rationality, and how it kind of proves Rand's argument that mystics abandon reality for the contents in their own mind, somehow just in there. They were born with them, innate. So I'm going to go to page 248 of this book. I'll try to get the glare out. I can't. There it is. Well, anyway, the book is A Dictionary of Philosophical Quotations, edited by A.J. Iyer and Jane O'Grady. I'm looking at page 248, quote number 9. Now I'm going to just take the last two lines of the quote. That's what really matters. There's some lead up to it, but we'll have to assume the lead up to it. Last two lines. Ideas, which you could equate with concepts back in his day, ideas and truths are innate in us. Innate. In other words, we're born with them. Like natural inclinations and dispositions, natural habits or potentialities. So, according to Leibniz, we have these concepts in our mind, and he doesn't or isn't able to explain how the heck they got in there. So again, he's abandoning reality for what he assumes was already in his head, while Hume would abandon his conceptual awareness and take the brain more as a sensory organ, and kind of without much thinking involved. You see it, but you can't conceptually discern from your perceptions. You can't move from perception to conceptual abilities, which is what Rand's epistemology was all about. Everything starts with perception, and then we make concepts. We don't make them out of thin air. They stem from perception of reality and can be brought back down to that base. So Rand, she did supersede the historical dichotomy of rationalists versus empiricists. Immanuel Kant tried to supersede, but in that dichotomy. But in doing so, he introduced an elaborate, somewhat absurd mechanism, monal and phenomenal worlds, and one we can't ever know anything about. And it's just kind of a castle in the sky that kind of interrupted the philosophical process for several decades. I hope I've answered your question sufficiently. Thanks.